Hello, thank you for joining the Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. My name is Ania Abrahamyan, and I welcome you at today's talk. Our speaker today is Dr. Nick Kupensky, and he will present on the minor peripheral transnational Anational, the Poetics and Politics of Andrii Karabelesh. Dr. Kupensky is an assistant professor in the Department of Foreign Languages at the United States Air Force Academy, where he teaches Russian and foreign area studies. He received his Ph.D. in Slavic Languages and Literatures from Yale University in 2017, and previously taught at Bowdoin College and Bucknell University. His research focuses on the aesthetics of industrial landscapes in Soviet Ukraine, and his work has appeared in Harvard Ukrainian Studies, Nationalities Papers, Ukraina moderna, Muzeinyi vistnik, Slovo, and Ukraine. He is currently writing a cultural history of the Dnipro Hydroelectric Station. He also serves as the vice president of the Carpatho-Rusyn Research Center, where he studies migration, nationalism, and peripheral modernism. His initiative in the digital and public humanities, the Emil Kubek Project, tells the story of the first Carpatho-Rusyn novelist and his coal mining community in central Pennsylvania. Please welcome Professor Kupensky.
Well, thank you, Anna, and thank you for the very kind introduction and for the opportunity to be with the Ukrainian Studies Organization once again. It's always my pleasure to speak with you. So I very much appreciate the invitation. And I want to thank you and Natalia and Svetlana and all of the people who may have played a role in putting this event together. So thank you. But before I jump into things, I must say that the views that I will express today belong solely to myself, and they don't represent those of the United States Air Force, Department of Defense, or United States government. So here we go. So when Deleuze and Guattari proposed their theory of minor literature, they turned to Franz Kafka, whose place in the triple ghetto of Prague's German-speaking Jewish community put him on the margins of Europe's major literary traditions. However, their framework also illuminates other parts of the political space Kafka would eventually inhabit, namely the First Republic's easternmost district of Subcarpathian Rus. Because indeed, if minor literature in their formulation is written by a minority in a major language, necessarily political, and the collective utterance of the people, then we could surely include the writer Andrii Karabelesh in the discussion of Czechoslovakia's minor traditions. Born into a Carpatho-Rusyn family in the Svaljava region, Karabelesh grew up in a Russian-speaking environment. He wrote poetry and prose in Russian, but he was committed to the ideals of the First Republic, whose support of Subcarpathia played a crucial role in his intellectual formation. At the same time, unlike the national awakeners of the 19th century, like Alexander Duknovich, he was arguably the first Russian writer to prioritize aesthetics over questions of national identity or politics. Yet, because he wrote in a language not entirely his own, Russian, his poetics can at times be derivative in nature, amply borrowing tropes from Pushkin and Lermontov, the style of Balmont, and the mysticism of Bloch. In fact, when Ilya Ehrenberg visited Subcarpathian Rus in 1927, he wrote that Karabelesh writes correctly in Russian, but he imitates the images of old Russian poets so much that it also almost sounds parodic. And so these various legacies, these various identities were on full display during Karabelesh's centenary celebration in 2006. The literary historian Valery Padyak published a selection of Karabelesh's poetry and prose in a volume called Izbranaya, and this volume presents Karabelesh as a Carpatho-Rusyn national poet. For Padyak, Karabelesh is a meteor ripping through the night sky, or a meteor ripping the night sky into two, a gladiator who was killed but never conquered by his difficult life and political circumstances. On the other hand, the Ukrainian writer Alexander Havrosh mocked Karabelesh's aesthetics, calling him a graphomaniac whose work proves you can't write literature in a foreign language. Otherwise, it'll be dead, inorganic, and clumsy. Furthermore, Havrosh says that calling Karabelesh a Carpatho-Rusyn national writer is just a joke, pointing out that Karabelesh never uses the term Rusyn in his poetry or prose. Yet, as Elaine Rosinko has rightly argued, this is largely by design, for the most political aspect of Karabelesh's work is the low profile of politics. Recently, scholars have begun to gloss this category of the minor with the prefix ultra, such as Birger Rona Moberg and David Damraj, who argue that ultra-minor literature is a more radical version of the minor. Ultra-minor literatures have structural handicaps and a systematic lack of capacity and resources. They often have no metropolis, large towns, or hinterland. They struggle with the feeling of belatedness and a short historicity of modernity. And rather than deterritorializing a hegemonic class, ultra-minor literatures are often used to create or bolster the community's territorial integrity. And all of these things most definitely would have been true of Subcarpathian Rus during the time when Karabelesh began his career. On the other hand, we can also see how Karabelesh participates in what Harsha Ram has called peripheral modernism, or an aesthetic that critiques the priorities of the metropolis while being dependent on a metropolitan vocabulary and discourse. And we can see this most clearly in the fact that Karabelesh borrows tropes from Russian symbolism, even if he mobilizes these tropes from symbolism to describe the beauty and the majesty of the Carpathian Mountains. At the same time, transnational approaches allow us to see how Karabelesh's poetics are both bigger and more local than the nation. Because his work is written in Russian, his poems travel beyond Subcarpathian Rus, as the saying goes, from the Poprad to the Pacific Ocean, even if his symbolic geography is exclusively focused on the southern slopes of the Carpathians. And Karabelesh basically never even writes about the northern slopes of the Carpathians. He's not interested in Galicia. He's not interested in Lempravina. He's only focused on Subcarpathian Rus. Finally, Agnieszka Halemba has observed that many Carpatho-Rusins, in fact, resist looking at the world through the lens of the nation, although state and citizenship are often important categories. To declare oneself to be Rusin is not necessarily to declare oneself to be a member of a nation, she argues, but often a refusal to participate in the history of Europe seen through a national lens. What Halemba calls an anational form of identification is a way of deploying national categories to express an ethical position rather than a national idea. Or in other words, to be Carpatho-Rusyn is to stand for something. So as part of Czechoslovakia's Russian-speaking Carpatho-Rusyn community, Karabelesh cultivates an anational orientation that prioritizes aesthetics as a unifying category, one which is connected to a constellation of ethical positions that animate and structure his verse. And typically the ethical positions that Karabelesh prioritizes are beauty, freedom, justice, and truth. So, born in 1906 in the village of Tibava in the Hungarian kingdom, Karabelesh spent his youth in the glades of the Carpathians, where his father worked as a forester for the Schönbrunn family. In 1920, after Subcarpathian Rus became part of the First Republic, he entered the Mukachevo Gymnasium, where he was educated by a group of Russian emigre professors who instilled in him a love of poetry. And the simultaneity of these two events would forever be linked for him. His discovery of the world of letters occurred because of the minority rights granted by the new Czechoslovak state. In the 6th grade, Karabelesh had to memorize Goethe's Erlkönig, a ballad about a delirious child carried by his father through the woods on horseback and tempted by the voice of a mystical forest king. The child, enchanted by the beautiful form of this forest king, gives in to his temptation and dies. The young boy shakes and cries out of fear, but nevertheless, he passionately longs to see a mysterious, fantastic world, or in Karabelesh's description of it, a неведомый сказочный мир. And Karabelesh said that I often feel that I've lived my life in a real delirium like that boy, boldly peering into the bright future far away. The next year, in 7th grade, Karabelesh read Pushkin's Winter Evening, which he thought perfectly captured the winter atmosphere in the Carpathians. Moreover, he was impressed that everything is so clear and written in our language, po-nashemu or po-nashomu. He was inspired to run, after reading the Russian, after reading Pushkin, he was inspired to run into the foothills of Mukachevo and recite Yevgeny Onegin and the Bronze Horseman. After reading about Pushkin's sexual exploits in Bessarabia, he started to chase after the gypsies near the monastery. He bought Lermontov, Gogol, Turgenev, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky in a local bookstore and spent his free time reading in the attic, in the most far-flung corners of the school dormitory, or in the forest on the banks of the Latoritsa, but beyond the monastery. And what links all of these episodes, being attracted by the mysterious world of the forest king, recognizing the beauty of the Carpathian winter only after reading Pushkin, transforming the forest into places of poetry, and reading in the attic or beyond the river. The thing that links all of these things is that literature became a different world Karabelesh could inhabit to escape the one around him. At the Mukachevo Gymnasium, Karabelesh began to write poetry under the tutelage of 2 professors, Alexander Popov and Natalia Shkirpan, who founded the journal Karpatsky Krai. And both of them placed Ivan Turgenev's prose poem, The Russian Language, as the epigraph to the first issue, which reads like this. In days of doubt, in days of distressing meditations on the fate of my homeland, you alone are my strength and support, O great, mighty, true, and free Russian language. If it were not for you, how could one not fall into despair at the sight of everything that's going on at home? But it's impossible to believe that such a language was not given to a great people. Turgenev's prose poem contained a number of features that appealed to Czechoslovakia's Subcarpathian Rusins. For example, its author expresses the feeling of doubt before his own literary production, and the feeling of despair when contemplating the social and political conditions of his homeland. However, the magnitude and might, truth and freedom of Russian give him hope that the dignity of the Russian language will convey dignity upon the Russian people. And this formula resonated so deeply with Karabelesh that he published his own imitation of it. And Karabelesh's Russian language opens by comparing Russian to the strings of a contemplative lyre, a bayonet in battle, a light in a dark apartment, and a shelter in a raging storm. And so here, Russian protects, saves, or guides him during moments of loneliness or danger. Russian is his only support in moments of doubt and heavy sadness. But unlike Turgenev, who associates the greatness of Russians with the greatness of the language, Karabelesh claims that Russian is the common patrimony of all Slavs. You are the eternal source of the Slavic race, he says. Most importantly, what Karabelesh most values about Russian are its moral qualities, or justice, sprawiedliwost, openness, prostor, and freedom, Svoboda. After graduating from the Mukachevo Gymnasium, Karabelesh's dream was to enroll in Charles University's philological faculty, but his father pressured him to study in Uzhorod's Greek Catholic seminary, which would have been free, and so he chose the free route. There, he felt alienated and isolated from his peers, and quickly befriended the head of the city library, the Russian emigre Yevgeny Nedelsky, who acquainted him with a new group of writers, Fiet, Tuchev, Balmont, and Bloch. Again, Russian literature served as a gateway to another better world for Karabelesh. He was so utterly absorbed by Dostoevsky's The Devils that he concealed inside a prayer book during church services. During classes on how to be a priest, he read Tolstoy's The Kingdom of God is Within You. And instead of attending a church banquet, he and a friend stole a bottle of wine, jumped the seminary walls, and ran around the city reciting Petöfi, Pushkin, and Lermontov. The next day, he woke up in a stupor on a park bench with a revelation. Theology isn't for us. We have to go to Prague. But during his time as a seminarian, Karabelesh gathered enough poems to release his first collection, Izbrani Stikotvorenia. And its lyrics bear a strong influence from Alexander Blok's Verses About a Beautiful Lady. For one of the predominant images is of a pleasant, ominous sunrise coming from the east. And we could see this trope in his lyric On the Border. It opens in the cold fall when the mountains slumber, but then rays of light begin to appear over the mountains. The rain and hail at home soon give way to peace and freedom coming from abroad. The lyrical subject confesses that I take pleasure from the east and want to leave my native land. But then the wind tells him, be faithful to your fatherland. Thus, if we're going to sort of look at the spatial orientation or the symbolic geography of this lyric, although Karabelesh is drawn to the light and enlightenment emanating from the east, that is Russian culture, the wind blowing from the west, or Czechoslovakia, is what inspires his commitment to the Carpathians. There is no sweeter love in life, it says. In it is pain and joy and peace. We also see this constellation of images in his second collection of poetry, In the Rays of Dawn, whose cover even illustrates how the Carpathians are associated with sleep and darkness, but the east, or what's on the other side of the mountains, is associated with awakening and light. A sweeping, if at times repetitive, collection of polished lyrics and fragments of poems for the future, In the Rays of Dawn so rarely situates his poems within space, aside for references to the Carpathians, that there are few moments when one would even be aware that it's written in Czechoslovakia, except for its very last poem, 10 Years, which is an ode to the First Republic. 10 Years begins by evoking temporal, not spatial categories, for the poem celebrates the end of Hungarian rule, the age of wild persecution, slavery, and imprisonment has passed. Now, the light of freedom shines over the country, and a new sweet brotherly light has burned for 10 years. Here, the light shines over the country, not from the east. And the adjective brotherly, or bratsky, becomes the key concept signaling his support of Czechoslovakia. In the final stanza, he calls upon his fatherland to rejoice and shine in freedom, happiness, and love. For they are united children of a single land, where a sweet brotherly light will shine on us for many, many years. And this mnogo let, or mnohaya lit, is the Eastern Rite Happy Birthday, and you see how the collection comes to a close, celebrating the 10 years of of Subcarpathian Rus being part of Czechoslovakia. The same year, Karabelesh left for Prague and abandoned the beautiful world of the written word for the Bohemian world of the capital. While his poetic output suffered, he continued to read Russian writers, now Gorky, Mayakovsky, Pasternak. While he eventually did receive his degree, he came to miss the mountains. And in a lyric written from this period called An Evening in Prague, Karabelesh concludes that the city whispers to me in a worn-out song about my beloved, unforgettable native land. And whatever it's like now, I don't care. I want to go home, go home, go home. And in 1935, he returned to Subcarpathia with his Czech wife to work as a professor, eventually in his alma mater, the Mukachevo Gymnasium. But not long after he began his post, Europe found itself on the brink of war. In September 1938, the Munich Pact awarded Germany the Sudetenlands. By October, the central government agreed to grant Subcarpathian Rus greater autonomy as well, with a government led by the Russophile premier Andrei Brody and minister Stefan Fencik. Brody unexpectedly called a referendum with the desire to unite Subcarpathian Rus with Hungary, which he assumed would better guarantee the interest of the region. However, Prague caught wind of this and replaced him before the vote could take place. By November, Hungary ultimately received parts of Subcarpathian Rus, and most importantly, its two biggest cities, Uzhhorod and Mukachevo, in the Vienna Award, which forced the region's government and institution to move east to Hust. And Karabelesh also evacuated with them. Betrayed by the Russophiles, who he felt sold out to the Hungarians, and abandoned by the Soviets, who he berated as more obsessed with the messianism of the Communist International than the 500,000 lives of a people far beyond the Carpathians, Karabelesh announced his decision to support the new government in Subcarpathian Rus, led by the Ukrainophile Augustin Voloshin. And while he publishes this text in Ukrainian, Karabelesh nonetheless frames his decision not in ethno-national terms, but out of the desire to raise his people to a European level of civilization. And he even imagines that by staying part of Czechoslovakia, even in this new Ukrainian environment in Subcarpathian Rus, he even imagines that the Carpathians could one day become a new Switzerland if they stay part of the new Czechoslovak state. But when Hungarian troops invaded in March 1939, Karabelesh became a persona non grata, accused of underground anti-governmental political activity in support of the Czech nation. Hounded by Hungarian gendarmes, Karabelesh fled to Litomyšl, where he taught Russian in the underground. But in June 1941, his luck ran out, and he was captured and sent to work in some of the most notorious Nazi work camps. The sources we have about Karabelesh's period as a political prisoner are limited, and we largely have to rely on his camp narrative, On the Brink of Death, Notes from Fascist Concentration Camps, which was published in 1953. But the text is not without its issues. Its prose narrative alternates between accounts of his horrific experiences in the camps and boilerplate Soviet historiography about the Russians from Subcarpathian Rus, who were oppressed for centuries by Hungarian invaders and bourgeois Czechs before being liberated by their Soviet brothers in the East. But the thread that links all of these episodes, the episodes from the camp narrative together, is how Karabelesh preserved his will to live, and his belief that the Nazis will be defeated is often attributed to his unwavering confidence in the Red Army and Stalin. Yet, while this Soviet scaffolding likely provided the ideological structure and cover to publish the text, Karabelesh leaves in legible seams that allow us to see that he finds the strength to survive because he longs to return to where, and often when, he came from, that is, interwar Subcarpathian Rus. And I'll talk about just a couple episodes. In one episode in Prague's Pankratz prison, Karabelesh describes how the prisoners were taken to buses where they were tortured. Those who died were thrown into the courtyard, registered as suicides. Afraid that he would be killed, Karabelesh took solace in the window of his cell that let in the morning light. And as he's looking through his cell, as he sees this light coming in, he realizes that's where the sun rises. That's where the East is. That's where Moscow and Stalin are. From this direction will come our liberation. And in his early symbolist-inspired verse, this rising sun served as a metaphor for the enlightenment of Russian literature, or the justice and freedom brought during the First Republic. But here, he transforms this image of light and transfers its liberating power to the Soviet Union. Yet, an accompanying lyric localizes his hope not in the Red Army, but in the Carpathians. And this is the lyric that you have on the screen. Blue and blue beyond the rusty bars, the threads of spiderwebs shine in the sun, flickering and clearly coming into view, is my native field, the expanse of my native valleys. Today death is mowing, the plow is cutting, but believe, my friend, in a year from the east will thunder our cannons, and the people will break our chains. And so here he looks out of his cell at the sky, and this image of the cell projected against the sky reminds him of looking through a spider web at the sun in his native fields of the Carpathians. And after remembering his home, he expresses confidence that our people will defeat the Nazis from the east. Which people these are, he curiously does not specify. Karabelesh describes another episode where he experienced the will to live, this time after being transferred to Buchenwald. In the fall of 1943, a series of explosions ripped through the camp, and the prisoners understood that Buchenwald was being bombed by the Allies. They took cover in a beech forest, where Karabelesh relished the beauty of the fall colors as this bombing campaign sort of plays out. And I'm going to read I'm going to read a little bit more of this quote just to get a sense of how he narrates this. So he says, Indian summer. I can imagine the fall back home. I remember the Carpathian thickets and forests. It's fall at home now, too. October. The deer cry out in the forests. The waterfalls roar in the mountains. Their deep plaintive hum fills the Carpathian ridges and gorges. Day and night, the silvery streams and rivers stir and boom, and the buzz of waterfalls drowns everything. It's louder than everything. I could hear it. Can I? Yes, I could hear the rumble of waterfalls. Because of the forest, there was a deep, monotonous buzz. It became stronger and stronger. An alarm. Planes are on the horizon, lots of them, a whole cloud of planes. And notice what he does here. So Karabelesh takes cover in this autumn forest. And that forest reminds him of the autumn forest in the Carpathians. And one of the things that makes the forest in the Carpathians so beautiful is the powerful sound of the waterfalls. This elemental force which echoes the sound of the airplanes that are striking his persecutors. And so it's almost as if the way that he sets this up is that the sound of the airplanes bombing the Nazis have the same characteristics of the powerful Carpathians making the forest and the glades beautiful. Karabelesh was transferred to Oranienburg, but he arrived so emaciated that he was immediately taken to the hospital. In the ward, he saw barely breathing skeletons, which made him think he would soon die. But at that moment, he looked out the window and noticed the sunrise. Morning rays, rays from the east. The sun is warming now my native Carpathians. The sun is looking at the village where I grew up. And then in a crucial pivot, he then imagines that his eastward turn to the Carpathians for strength is being echoed by his mother, who looks to the west in search of him. And the psychosomatic effect from this episode is so instantaneous that by the time the doctor comes back into the room, Karabelesh says that he had improved enough and was eventually able to be nursed back to health. And again, what's crucial about this episode is that this circuit of symbolic empowerment cuts out the Soviet Union altogether. It's the Carpathians that strengthen Karabelesh. In early 1945, he was transferred to Prague, where those who survived immediately rebelled, escaped captivity, and joined the Prague Uprising. Again, the ecstasy of the anticipated defeat of the Nazis causes Karabelesh to remember the beauty of the Carpathians, the sights and sounds of which share the same symbolic forms as the urban scenes of Prague. He writes, the May evening of Prague is no worse than the warm May nights at home. Even if here you can't see the flowering gardens and the aromatic cherries, the nightingales don't sing over the river and the willows, the old Carpathian beach forest doesn't rustle. But all this poetry of life is reflected in the blossoming faces of Prague's beauties, their Františeks, and even in the faces of old ladies and old men. Again, we could see how Karabelesh's memories of the Carpathians become the prism through which he views everything around him. The spring evening in Prague becomes powerful because it reminds him of the spring evenings back home. The vitality of the Czechs reminds him of the vitality of the mountains. And what makes Karabelesh's narrative remarkable is how each of these identities, each of his identities, helps him survive great alienation, suffering, and heartbreak. When the world around him was gloomy or intolerable or horrific, Karabelesh, the artist, often took refuge in the rich, beautiful world of Russian poetry. As a citizen of Czechoslovakia, he was a staunch supporter of the First Republic's democratic ideals of justice, freedom, and truth. Yet, as a Carpatho-Rusyn, he found solace and peace and calm in the natural rhythms of the Carpathians, a type of quiet strength that gave him the will to live during the horrors and the sufferings of the worst of the camps. But after the war, Karabelesh's struggles did not come to an end, as he tried to find his place in the new post-war order. While he was imprisoned, his wife was told that he had died, and as Karabelesh quickly learned, had remarried a local Czech engineer. And so when he arrived at his wife's home in Litomyshl, his children didn't even recognize him and turned to their mother in fear to ask why a beggar, or zhiprak, was staying in their home. Karabelesh stayed with his wife, or near his wife and her family, while he regained his health. And his desire to be near his children was stronger than his desire to return to the Carpathians, which, much to his surprise and regret, were now on the other side of the Czechoslovak border in Soviet Ukraine. The struggle for survival takes all of my time, he described. My muse was silent. And so as he is convalescing, he wrote very little in this period, mainly working as a teacher to sort of get by. But once Czechoslovakia came to be ruled by the Communist Party, Karabelesh found himself in an environment where his work would be expected to express a new ideological imperative and do so within the Ukrainian section of the Union of Slovak Writers. But by 1952, Karabelesh decided to try to revive his literary career and moved to Prešov to serve as an editor for the Cultural Union of Ukrainian Writers. He started reading again and became acquainted with the work of Soviet writers, such as Mikhail Isakovsky, Alexander Tverdovsky, Alexei Surkov, and Stepan Shipachov. And his editorial work allowed him to visit Carpatho-Rusyn villages in eastern Slovakia. And these Rusin villages, he uses the term Ruskia, but it's clear he has in mind these Carpatho-Rusyn villages. He says that they have a positive influence on my literary endeavors, and they brought to life memories about my native Zakarpattia. He said, I hear the live Rusin language, and I'm befriending Rusin workers and peasants. And all of this seems to inspire him to start writing again. And so when his camp narrative On the Brink of Death appeared in 1953, Karabelesh had managed to modulate his aesthetic to accommodate the ideological demands of the age. However, not everyone was convinced of the sincerity of Karabelesh's newfound convictions and conversion into a Soviet writer. In 1957, the literary critic Yuri Baleha launched a campaign to expose Karabelesh's ideological errors, arguing that his early work was often hostile towards the Soviet Union. Seizing upon Karabelesh's favorite image of the rising sun, Baleha points out that in the image of a miraculous morning, Karabelesh periodically looks to the east and sees that everything there was covered in darkness. He doesn't see, and Baleha argues, he doesn't see the gigantic construction of a new world, but he only hears the despondent, bitter cry of the East. This campaign proved to be successful, for Karabelesh was excluded from the Ukrainian section of the Union of Slovak Writers, and he used this professional defeat as a reason to retire, ultimately retiring in Bohemia. As the years went by and his health began to fail, Karabelesh made one last appeal to return home to the Carpathians. And it was finally granted in 1964 when his reputation was rehabilitated and he was sort of reinstated as a member of the Union of Writers. And so in 1964, before he died, a few months after returning to Zakarpattia, he wrote one last lyric, an unpublished lyric that only was published after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which captures what he imagined his legacy would be. And he writes this: I think recognition will come, but after death, I cough on it. Let a dog raise its leg on the edge of my monument. Let it wet and water the chrysanthemums. This is sweeter than false tears. There's no happiness where a cursed system turns human happiness into manure. I think recognition will come, but I will already be reborn in the grass. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kupensky, for such a rich and interesting presentation of Karabelesh and his writing. We will now open the floor to discussion. You can either unmute yourself and directly ask your question or maybe address your comment to Dr. Kupensky, or you can use the chat to type out your question and I will read it for everyone.
Well, taking advantage of this pregnant pause, because no one ever wants to ask the first question. So am I hearable?
Yes.
Yeah, Actually, I have two questions of really a very pedestrian style or manner. Early on, you said that one of the most influential poems on the young Karabelesh was Goethe's Erlkönig, and that he had read this and it stayed with him, the image, for a long time. I'm very curious, did he read this in the German original or in a Russian translation or in a Galician Ukrainian translation, which is actually available already in the late 19th century? And I asked the question simply because he was in a multicultural environment in the gymnasium, and German might have been one of the languages, aside from all of the Slavic variants, Slavic languages that were taught to students. So what was it? Do you know? Was it in a Russian translation or was it in the original German?
He doesn't specify in his biography, but I do think both are possible. Mm-hmm. When he writes about this section in his autobiography, he refers to specific moments in the poem. You know, he's writing in Russian, and he's referring to specific moments in the poem, and he's quoting specific moments of the poem, and he's quoting them in Russian. Mm. But the quotations don't seem to be from Zhukovsky's translation. The quotations seem to be his own translation, and throughout his life, Karabelesh frequently expresses great admiration of German literature, German music, German culture. So I think in all likelihood, he knew a certain amount of German and probably read it in the original. Maybe he read it in translation as well, but I think he had I'm assuming that he has enough German to read it, to read it in German. Mm-hmm. And there's a really remarkable moment during his camp narrative where he talks about his great familiarity with German culture, where during a particular moment, I think there's one moment where he sort of steps outside his barracks and it's spring, and he sees the SS officers cultivating like flowers next to their houses, and he says, what do these Germans know anything, or what do these Germans know anything about aesthetics? They don't even know their own tradition of aesthetics, of Goethe, of Schiller, of Beethoven. And he has this long extended passage that basically says, that's the German culture that I still love and still admire. And the Nazis around me, these are the aberration. So I do think that he probably was reading in German, though I don't know for sure.
The other quick question is that several times on the screen, you had translations of either prose or poetry coming up in English. Mm-hmm. Now, are these your translations just to make and made look nice because they look like they're on a printed page, or is there English translations of Karabelesh's work somewhere? And if so, where?
No, these are just my translations to sort of speed up the presentation process and make things go smoothly.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question, and very nice to see you, by the way.
Me too.
I also have a question. Professor Kupensky, you use this concept of a national literature, and you view Karabelesh's writing as a kind of belonging to this classification. And I wanted to ask, were there any writers contemporaneous with him that were also writing close to this tradition and using these same kind of categories beyond nationality and who they were?
To be perfectly honest, not that I'm aware of. In this sense, one of the things that attracts me to Karabelesh as a writer is the fact that he seems to be relatively anomalous in the sense that he is not as thoroughly invested in the politics of national identity as many of the people in Subcarpathian Rus were at the time. Because when Subcarpathian Rus joined Czechoslovakia, there were very active debates and quarrels and fights between basically two camps, the Russophile camp and the Ukrainophile camp. And both camps articulated both camps used Russia or Russian identity and Ukrainian identity as a way of sort of bolstering their own position within this post-war order. And while Karabelesh does write in Russian, and while Karabelesh writes about Russian culture, what's unique to me, what's unique and interesting about his verse is that he really goes to great lengths to reject these national categories. And it's very difficult to even pin him down in articulating who he thinks his narod is, because he uses the word narod a lot, but are they Ukrainians? Are they Russians? Are they Carpatho-Rusyns? Are they Czechoslovak? He's not interested in these national categories, which he finds to be destructive. And even in there was that one article that I quoted where he starts that's published in Ukrainian, and where he basically announces, well, I would rather be in Czechoslovakia than in Hungary, and the Ukrainian movement is the best guarantor of keeping Czechoslovakia together, so I will now be in this camp. But even in announcing that he is going to throw his support behind the Ukrainophile movement, he says that this question of national identification is, I think, is stupid or ridiculous or something like that. And so he's interested in other categories. And so the national fights and the type of politics of national identity that often provoke fights around these type of topics in Transcarpathia, he's not interested in. He's interested in other things.
I have sort of a follow-up question after that. Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Professor Kupensky. Still, we can sort of attribute Karabelesh to Russophile camp, maybe not in the sense that he identifies himself as a Russian, but rather he still embraced Russian culture, and he was in that Russophile milieu. He was with, you mentioned Nedelsky, who was one of his teachers. He also, when there was this campaign in the 50s, actually the guys who defended him in the Soviet Ukraine was Petr Lintur, and Lintur was also received some negative comments and even threats to his position as the university professor. So I just wondered then, still we can ascribe this Russophile identity to Karabelesh, but he's not that clear-cut Russian, or understood himself as a Russian. Then what does this Russophile, Ukrainophile, or Russophile identity, still cultural orientations mean? Not necessarily maybe as something describing national identity, but still they are there, and maybe how Karabelesh's case sort of helps us to reinterpret them or make them nuanced, more broader.
Thank you, Yaroslav, for a really good question. The way that I read Karabelesh's Poetics and the way that I make sense of his politics is, for lack of a better image, he takes a sort of buffet style to national identity, and there's certain things that are of value to him that he sort of picks and chooses from various traditions at various moments. The most important thing that he takes from the Russian tradition is the literary language and the access and inspiration to a major literary tradition. The moments when he becomes associated with the Ukrainophile movement in 1939, after the Russophiles throw their lot in with Hungary, the thing that attracts him to the Ukrainophile camp at that particular moment is not the national orientation, but a certain political bloc that will try to preserve the territorial integrity, or what's left of it, of Czechoslovakia. And then after the war, his association with the Ukrainophile camp is strictly as a matter of political necessity. Strictly as a matter of political necessity, and as a way to get back into the world of letters. So just as previously Russian was his access to the world of literature, in the post-war order, he has to reconceive himself within this Ukrainian system, and he does so relatively freely. You know, he in one particular edition of Dukla, there's a commemoration of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, and Karabelesh has a long poem on how Khmelnytsky brought Ukraine and Russia together, and sort of he responds in it's a sort of it's an idiosyncratic ode to Khmelnytsky, written in Russian in Czechoslovakia. And so the moments when he participates with the Ukrainian camp, there's something that he wants from it. And so I take a sort of functionalist or an instrumentalist reading of that. But his association with Czechoslovakia, for all he remains relatively committed to the ideals of the First Republic until relatively late in his career. And he becomes disillusioned with communist Czechoslovakia. But even in his camp narrative, and even in a lot of his writing in Dukla and his poetry in the 1950s, you still see flickers and images of this discourse of freedom, of justice. But he reframes these ideas of freedom and justice as being Soviet phenomena rather than phenomena from the First Republic. But it's clear that he's in the same symbolic universe. But at the end of the day, Karabelesh almost never writes about anything except Subcarpathian Rus. So if we're looking for a Rusin identity, or like the Rus in Karabelesh, it has to do with his symbolic geography. He clearly takes all of his inspiration from the mountains and from the physical landscape, from the natural landscape of Subcarpathian Rus. And so by doing so, he doesn't have to use the word Rusin to be Rusin, because he's writing about a common experience, and he's writing about a sort of shared landscape, a shared cultural tradition.
I believe we have time for one more question. Thank you, Brian. Go ahead.
Can I go? You ended with a very interesting bit about dogs peeing on his grave and all of this. I'm curious what the current reception of Karabelesh is. I mean, I know that he's if he's popular anywhere, it's in Carpatho-Rusyn circles. Is there any broader reception of him in Ukraine, in Slovakia, Czechoslovakia, or Czech Republic? I know there's a small monument in Svaljevo in the context of a larger Carpatho-Rusyn thing.
I touched upon this a little bit at the beginning of the talk, but there's, in spite of the fact that Karabelesh, at least in my reading, is somebody who resists national categories, both the Carpatho-Rusyn movement and the Ukrainians in Zakarpattia now read him through this national lens. And so, as you rightly said, Karabelesh's work is often included in Carpatho-Rusyn periodicals, though with a bit of skepticism and hesitancy because he's such a strong Russophile, and especially after the Revolution of Dignity and the war in Donbass, embracing such an enthusiastic Russophile without doing it carefully is maybe something that people don't try and emphasize. But so yeah, I mean, I think Karabelesh his legacy is rehabilitated in certain ways in the Carpatho-Rusyn movement, who sees him as a poet who is interested in being a poet. And this is Elaine's argument, that he's the first Rusyn poet whose main goal is to write poetry and not sort of awaken the sleeping masses and bring on a sort of national renaissance, a Carpatho-Rusyn national renaissance. Among his, in terms of his reception among Ukrainian culture, the person whose comments on Karabelesh I've read most extensively are Alexander Havrosh. And Havrosh uses Karabelesh as a sort of, as a way of trying to discredit the Rusyn movement, or as he selectively reads Karabelesh in a way that, he quotes the moments where Karabelesh has awkward phrases in Russian and says, look, this is your this is your first poet who is interested in producing works of poetic quality. Look at that. He can't even write in the language he can't even write in this Muscovite language that he loves so much.
Although in fairness, Havrosh is doing that on literally anything possible. So
there's maybe nothing especially surprising about Karabelesh's reception in modern day Zakarpattia, but which is why I'm working on this project and why I started this project, because I think both camps misread him, and I think both camps misread his aesthetics and misread the thing that's actually interesting about his aesthetics is that he's operating with these different categories that are not national categories and not dependent upon the success or failure of one national movement or another. So thanks a lot for your question.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Today, Dr. Nick Kupensky presented on the minor Peripheral, Transnational, National, the Poetics and Politics of Andrii Karabelesh. Thank you so much for your lecture, Dr. Kupensky, and thank you to all of our attendees for being with us today. Information about the upcoming events will be posted on the UkrSO listserv and on our Facebook page, Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. You can also view previous lectures and talks on our YouTube channel, and you can subscribe to our channel for future events. Thank you so much for attending today.